Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Please like and subscribe to keep me motivated to tell more interesting stories. Now, let's get started. I remember Hiroshima before the sky tore open. It was the kind of city that woke up gently with the sounds of cicadas rubbing their wings against the thick August air, and the splash of oars cutting through the rivers that veined through town like old scars. Most people don't realize Hiroshima was a city of water, 6 rivers flowing quietly through it, and countless bridges connecting a maze of neighborhoods. We used to joke that if Venice had bicycles and more pickled plums, it'd be called Hiroshima. That summer, the Lantern Festival was coming. You know, the one where we float paper lanterns on the water for the souls of the dead. Bit ironic now. Kids were practicing their brushwork for their messages to the ancestors. I helped my neighbor's son fold one. He spelled grandpa with the wrong stroke and giggled like he'd just invented a new language. The war. It felt far away. Sure, there were rations and drills, and yes, we saw the boys leaving in uniforms and not coming back. But we kept going. People still sold sweet potato cakes on street corners. You still had to remind your cousin to return your bicycle. Life doesn't pause just because governments are arguing with bombs. My house sat near the edge of the city, tucked behind a temple with crumbling steps and cats that believed they were divine. I'd wake up to the temple bell and the smell of miso soup. Not a bad way to start the day. The market was 3 blocks down, fresh fish on ice that melted before noon. Pickled radish so strong it could punch you in the sinuses, and one old man who claimed he once sold oranges to the emperor. Nobody believed him, but we liked the story anyway. We heard rumors, though. Whispered names like little boy, like a bad joke. People said America was working on something big, something that could end the war in one move. Most of us just shrugged. Rumors float around like ghosts in war. You only believe the ones that knock on your front door. But there was one tiny thing that stuck with me. About 2 weeks before August 6th, I saw a strange man in the city. Tall, foreign, definitely not from around here. He had a camera and a notebook, and he spoke to no one. Just watched. Took notes. Historians still debate whether he was part of some pre-bomb recon or just a lost tourist who read the wrong train map. Either way, I remember him clearly. He looked at the city like he knew something terrible was coming. Sometimes I think about that man. Whether he left in time, whether he warned anyone, whether he even understood what he was witnessing. Now here's a random thing I once read, that cats can sense earthquakes before they happen. They say the change in atmospheric pressure makes them skittish. A day before the bombing, every cat in my alley disappeared. Vanished. Not one furry tail in sight. Coincidence? Maybe. But I've learned that when nature gets nervous, it's time to duck. On the night of August 5th, Hiroshima glowed like it always did. Soft lamps in windows, paper walls breathing in the warm breeze. A child cried 2 houses over because she dropped her rice ball. The world was heartbreakingly normal. I slept deeply that night. No dreams, just that kind of sleep where you're not aware of your body, like you've been poured into darkness and sealed there. If I had known what was coming, I might have chosen to stay asleep forever. But I woke up to bird song, of all things, and the smell of fresh earth, like the kind you get after a thunderstorm. I had no idea that morning would be the last time Hiroshima looked like a city of lanterns and laughter. It's strange, right? That a place can hold so much joy, and then in a blink, become a monument to horror. That's the thing with history. It doesn't wait for you to finish your breakfast. The morning of August 6, 1945, started like any other. The sky was an absurd kind of blue, the type you'd only see on postcards or bad watercolor paintings. Not a single cloud, not even a hint of a breeze. I remember thinking, this heat's going to melt my shoes. I was wrong. My shoes didn't have the chance to melt. I had errands to run, the usual stuff. Pick up rice check if the fish vendor had sardines that weren't pretending to be jerky, and remind my uncle to stop telling everyone he was a war hero just because he once saluted a general by accident. The streets buzzed like a beehive on summer tea. We had air raid drills regularly, of course, but they'd become background noise by then. Most of us barely flinched when the sirens blared. You'd just keep walking and pretend not to notice. It was kind of a local hobby, outstaring the fear. Around 7:30 a.m., I remember glancing up and seeing 3 children chasing a cart full of vegetables. They were laughing, one barefoot, one with mismatched socks, and one carrying a stick like it was a sword. I looked away for maybe 2 seconds. Then the sky opened up. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't anything that had a name before that day. It was like the air had been split in half by a scream, but the scream was silent. There was a flash, a white light so bright it didn't look like light at all. It looked like everything was being erased at once. Then came the sound. Not a bang, not a boom. More like the world being punched in the stomach. A low, rolling roar that made your bones feel like jelly. It didn't just hit your ears, it crushed your insides. I wasn't at the epicenter. If I had been, I wouldn't be telling this story. I was maybe 1.5 kilometers away. But even from there, the force threw me like a paper doll across the room. I remember the windows exploded inward. My ears rang. My arms burned. The ceiling buckled like it had forgotten how to stay upright. I thought I had died. I really did. There was this split second where I felt my body stop being a body. I was just a thought floating in heat. Some people say their life flashes before their eyes. Not me. All I saw was that blue sky turning into a mouth that swallowed everything. You know what's funny? Well, funny in the darkest way possible. At that exact moment, a pigeon crashed into my face. No, really, a bird. Just smack. I guess it had been thrown by the blast. 2. I sat there on the floor, half blind, from the light bleeding from somewhere I couldn't locate, and this charred pigeon flopped next to me, like it was also asking, what the hell just happened? Later, I found out that what hit us was a 15-kiloton atomic bomb, code-named Little Boy. It exploded 600 meters above the city, instantly vaporizing thousands of people. The temperature at ground zero was estimated to reach over 1 million degrees Celsius. I can't even wrap my head around that. Like, what does 1 million degrees feel like? Nothing. You don't feel it. You're just gone. Historians still debate whether the U.S. military fully grasped the level of destruction the bomb would cause. Some argue it was a calculated move to force surrender. Others say it was a demonstration meant more for the Soviets than Japan. And then there are those who whisper that Hiroshima was chosen precisely because it hadn't been bombed before, so they could study the full effect in a pristine environment. Science wrapped in horror. Who knows? The immediate shockwave flattened everything within 2 kilometers. Trees, houses, people. Gone. Turned to shadows. Literally. That's a thing people don't talk about enough, the shadows. Those eerie outlines left on walls and sidewalks. Human shapes permanently burned into stone by the flash. A woman holding her child. A man on a bicycle. A dog mid-run. The light was so intense it froze their final moment. The aftermath didn't make sense. I stumbled outside, choking on dust and blood, and nothing looked familiar. My street gone. The temple gone. The cat still gone. The air had this color to it, brown, red, and gray, all smeared together, like the sky had tried to paint itself, but ran out of decent brushes. And the silence. That's what really messed with me. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring louder. No birds, no shouting, no crying, just the sound of nothing. That was worse than the blast. You'd think there would be chaos. People running, screaming something. But most people couldn't even stand. The ones who could walk didn't know where to go. I saw a man walking without his skin, just calmly placing one foot in front of the other. His eyes weren't panicked, just empty. Like he'd seen something so awful that his soul decided to leave early. There's one detail I'll never forget. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6, stood in the ruins holding a rice ball. Her dress was scorched, her hair stuck to her face, but she just stood there, staring at the spot where her house used to be. I walked past her thinking, say something, help her, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was too broken myself. And maybe that's the worst part, that you see people hurting, burning, dying, and all you can do is walk past, because your brain is still catching up with what just happened. By 9 a.m., the sky had gone from blue to something else. Smoke curled upward in spirals. Fires broke out like weeds, and still, I thought, maybe this was just one bomb. Maybe we'll get help soon. Like the world had some emergency backup plan for this level of hell. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The thing about the atomic bomb is no one tells you what to expect when time stops. It wasn't just the heat, or the pressure, or the explosion. It was everything happening at once, and none of it making sense. One moment, I was on the ground, trying to decide whether I was dead. The next, I was walking, stumbling, floating maybe. My sandals had vanished, the soles of my feet sizzling on glass that used to be pavement. Hiroshima wasn't a city anymore. It was a sketch someone had tried to erase with fire. The flash had been brighter than 1,000 suns, they said later. And yeah, I believe that. It seared itself into the back of my eyes. Days afterward, I still saw outlines of rooftops burned into my vision, like a bad photograph left in the sun. There were no shadows anymore, just outlines, where people used to be. Imagine that your last breath immortalized as a dark smudge on a wall. Not a grave, not a name, just a mark. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd have thought it was some post-war rumor. But no, I leaned against one, just stared at it. You could almost see the folds of a kimono, a hand, a head bowed low. Maybe they were praying, or maybe they just ducked. I don't remember choosing a direction, but my body moved toward the river. Everyone else was doing the same. Something in our brains said, water. You need water. Not just to drink, to escape the fire, the heat, the fear. I joined the line of scorched ghosts shambling through what used to be a park. Trees looked like matchsticks. A woman next to me held her arm like it didn't belong to her anymore. It swung limp fingers fused together. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. That was the theme of the day, no screaming. You'd think hell would be loud. It wasn't. Odd fact. Here's one for you. During the testing phase of the Manhattan Project, scientists calculated that there was a very slight chance that the bomb might ignite the entire atmosphere. As in set the sky on fire. Literally. They did the math, ran the numbers, and concluded it was probably safe. Probably. Then they tested it anyway. Boom, welcome to science. So now, I'm standing by the Motoyasu River. It should have been refreshing, comforting, familiar. But it wasn't. The water was thick, murky. Ash floated on top like confetti from some horrific parade. People crawled into it, their skin hanging off them in ribbons. Some just sat there, neck-deep heads tilted up to the sky, as if they were waiting for someone to say, "Just kidding." Others didn't make it. They collapsed at the edge, steam rising from their bodies like tea kettles. Some were already dead, but still floating. The river didn't care. It held all of us. The living, the barely living, the never going to make it. I dipped my hands in and brought the water to my lips, even though every instinct screamed not to. It tasted like metal and smoke, but it was cold, and that was enough. One man I remember clearly kept repeating the same word over and over, hot, 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 not shouting, just whispering, like he thought if he said it enough, someone would cool him down. His back looked like wax melted off a candle. I sat beside him, not to help, just to exist near someone else who still had a heartbeat. At one point, I noticed a school uniform floating by, neatly folded somehow untouched. No body, just cloth, drifting like it had somewhere to go. I stared at it for too long. Everything was surreal by then. You could have told me the sky would open and God would descend with a mop, and I'd have believed you. Historians still debate whether Hiroshima was warned. Some say leaflets were dropped ahead of time, vague threats about destruction. Others argue that no specific notice was given, and the people had no clue what was coming. Either way, we weren't prepared. And I don't think preparation would have made a difference. There's no practice drill for apocalypse. Now, there's a bit of comedy in this horror. Not ha-ha funny, more like absurdly tragic. My friend Koji, who had always been terrified of water, ended up becoming a human raft. He couldn't swim, never learned, but that day he waded into the river like it was a bathtub. We found him later, still clutching his satchel full of rice cakes, half melted, somehow uneaten. Koji always worried about his lunch. I moved with the crowd, or what was left of it, toward a bridge that had partly collapsed. People still tried to cross it. Some fell in. Some kept walking barefoot over twisted metal, like pain had been turned off for the day. I stepped over what I think used to be a dog, charred, curled, still wearing a collar. My throat burned, not just from smoke, but from something deeper, like my body was rejecting the air itself. The sky had changed. It was brown now, thicker, alive somehow, like it was watching us and trying not to blink. It's strange what you think about in moments like these. I kept remembering this riddle my cousin used to tell. What walks on four legs in the morning, two in the afternoon, and three in the evening? The answer's a human, of course. Baby to adult, to old man with a cane. But now, seeing people crawl, stagger, and drag limbs behind them, the answer felt less clever, more literal. Humanity reduced to riddles with no punchline. By the time the sun had begun to dip, the city looked like the moon. Craters, smoke, a grayness that ate the light. No birds, no bugs, just that awful, thick silence. I found a piece of mirror sticking out of the rubble. Looked at myself. Couldn't tell who I was. Just blackened skin and eyes that didn't blink. That was the day I learned what it meant to survive something you weren't meant to. You ever try walking barefoot through a city that doesn't exist anymore? Yeah, me neither. Not until then. The pavement was no longer pavement. It was a mosaic of glassy patches, molten metal streaks, and burned debris sharp enough to slice your soul. I didn't even feel it at first. My feet just moved like they were on autopilot, probably because every other nerve in my body had shut down. Later, when I looked, they were torn to shreds. But pain was a luxury we couldn't afford that day. I didn't have a destination, just this nagging instinct to find shelter. It's funny in hindsight, like a roof was going to save me from what had already happened. Still, my body craved walls. Even if they were broken, even if they were barely standing. I wandered past buildings that had collapsed into themselves like they were tired of trying. A telephone pole leaned at an angle, wires dangling like limp noodles. One of them sparked a little. No electricity, of course, but somehow it still sizzled like it didn't get the memo. Eventually, I found what was left of a school iron beams curled like vines, half a chalkboard, still hanging on one cracked wall, a child's shoe in the middle of the rubble. The kind with the little bunny embroidered on it. I picked it up and immediately wished I hadn't. The air inside was thicker. Dust, smoke, blood. But it was quiet. Not peaceful, just less chaotic. A few others were already there, huddled against what used to be a teacher's podium. No one spoke. One woman held a bundle in her lap. I thought it was a blanket. It wasn't. I sat down, bones creaking like a centuries-old floorboard. Across from me was a boy maybe 10. His face was caked with soot. His nose bled slowly. He blinked at me, then held out a tin cup. "Water," he croaked. I had none. "No," I whispered. He nodded like he expected that answer anyway. Then strangely, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a marble. Blue, cloudy, perfect. He rolled it in his fingers and smiled. As if in all this ruin, he still had something beautiful. You know what's messed up. That marble was probably radioactive. But it was the only thing that sparkled in that whole building. A little ball of childhood, stubborn enough to survive nuclear war. There were others, too. A girl curled up in the corner, humming a tune. An elderly man missing half his face. A teacher judging by the badge pinned to his burned sleeve staring blankly at the ceiling. I wanted to speak, say something human. But what could I possibly say? Historians still debate how many people died instantly, how many in the hours that followed, and how many later from radiation. Estimates vary. 70,000, 80,000, maybe more. No one really knows, because some people were never found. Not even bones, just shadows, just memories clinging to the air. But here's a weird fact. After the bombing, the only building near the epicenter that remained partially standing was the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. You might know it today as the Atomic Bomb Dome. It was spared not by chance, but by geometry. The bomb exploded almost directly overhead, and the downward force missed the center of the dome. Science and symmetry, unintended preservation. Back in the school hours past, or maybe it was minutes. Time had no rules anymore. At some point, someone tried to sing. A lullaby, I think. The voice cracked, warbled, but it floated through the air like incense. It was the first sound that didn't come from pain. Then came the aftershocks. Not earthquakes, though those came later, but the realization kind. People started to register what had happened, where their families were, who was missing. One woman started shouting names, Akiko Harukenji, over and over. No answers, just echoes. I crawled toward what used to be a classroom door. It hung crooked, like it was tired of standing. Beyond it, the hallway looked like a war painting come to life, colors smeared in rust and ash. A child's notebook fluttered against a cracked wall. I picked it up. Page after page of kanji practice. Perfect, patient lines. On the last page, a drawing of a cat. That broke me. Not the melted streets, not the bleeding bodies, but a child's drawing of a cat, because it reminded me of everything that had been so normal just hours ago. I needed air, real air. I stumbled back outside. The sun was lower now, but the heat hadn't left. Fires flickered here and there. You could hear them crackling like they were chewing on history. In the distance, I saw a group of men pulling people from the wreckage of a house. One of them stopped, looked at me, and gave a half nod. Like, yeah, we're still alive. Somehow, I nodded back. That was enough. Now here's a moment of absurdity. I saw him wearing only a necktie and socks, calmly carrying a record player. No idea where he was going, but he moved like he had a purpose. The human brain is weird. We cling to rituals, objects, even jokes. Maybe that record player held his wedding song, or maybe he just thought, if I have music, I'm still me. That school became my refuge for the night. The sun dipped into a bloody horizon, and the sky turned the color of bruises. People gathered in the ruins. Some cried. Some stared. Some whispered names to no one. I curled up in a corner with the marble boy and the humming girl. Didn't sleep. Just waited. Waited for what? I didn't know. Rescue, rain, death. I think I was just waiting for someone to tell me it was over. At dawn, we dragged ourselves toward the rivers again. The air smelled different. Not like burning something else. Something sour, like rust mixed with wet leaves and regret. A fog had crept in during the night, and it clung to us like guilt. We weren't walking anymore. We were limping shadows. Figures caught between dying and surviving and not really wanting either. The river was quiet. The fires had mostly gone out, and the smoke floated above like a heavy curtain that refused to rise. I stepped into the shallows, and it hit me. The water was warm. Not sun-warmed, not summer-warmed, warm like blood. Warm like something that used to be alive. Bodies lined the banks, not dozens, hundreds. Some crouched, as if in prayer, still and folded. Others face down, skin peeling like old paint. And some still moved ever so slightly, like leaves caught in a slow current. One man looked up at me from the water mouth open in a question I couldn't answer. I squatted by the river and dipped my hands again. This time I didn't drink. I just watched the way the ripples carried ash, how it swirled like milk and tea. It should have been peaceful. But it wasn't. It was wrong. The river had become a graveyard, a whispering one. Every splash seemed to say, "Remember us. Remember this." That's when I heard the first voice. Not a scream, a whisper. "Help." I turned. A woman, maybe 20, crawling through the mud. Her kimono was burned off one shoulder. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. She pointed toward the water. I followed her gesture and saw what she meant. A child barely floating, clinging to a bit of driftwood. I waded in my legs, screaming with every step. The water pulled at me like it didn't want to let go. I reached the child, a boy limp breathing shallow. I carried him back to the bank and laid him down. The woman crawled to him, cradled him, and said nothing. Just rocked. I backed away. That felt like their moment. Mine was just to bear witness. Historians still debate how many died trying to escape into the rivers. Some say a third of Hiroshima's casualties were from fire and radiation. But others argue the water was both sanctuary and executioner. It gave hope, but it offered no healing. Not when your skin was cooked from the inside out. And then the rain came. At first, we were relieved. Water from the sky, finally. We opened our mouths like children. We let it fall into our eyes, onto our burns. It was cool, refreshing. And it was black, thick, tar-like, oily black rain. I looked at my arms. The droplets didn't soak in, they streaked down like ink. Some people danced in it. Others cupped their hands to collect it. But something about it felt wrong. Like the sky wasn't trying to help. It was trying to finish the job. Later, of course, we learned it was radioactive fallout. Dust and ash fused with moisture in the atmosphere, rained back down on us as poison. But in that moment, we welcomed it. Isn't that twisted? We were so desperate, we embraced death thinking it was mercy. Here's a bizarre fact to lighten the mood, if that's even possible here. One of the few animals to survive relatively unscathed in certain parts of Hiroshima: cockroaches. Yeah, roaches. Turns out their cells divide much slower than ours, making them slightly more resistant to radiation. Humanity touched hell, and the cockroaches held a block party. Back at the riverside, I sat beside a man who was writing something in the mud. His finger traced slow characters kanji I couldn't quite read from my angle. I asked him what he was writing. Names, he said. Yours? No. Theirs. He didn't look up, just kept writing, even as the rain turned his characters into soup. That's when the rescue teams finally began to arrive. Sort of. Soldiers, doctors, civilians from outside the blast zone. They moved like sleepwalkers, covering their faces with cloth. Some wearing uniforms, others in whatever they'd grabbed that morning. One carried a megaphone with no batteries. Another had bandages, but no water. They looked as lost as we were. I remember one doctor, young, shaking with glasses, so fogged up, I couldn't see his eyes. He took one look at my feet, said, "You need to get those cleaned," then moved on. I wanted to laugh, as if soap was going to fix this. They started organizing the wounded, prioritizing who could be saved, who couldn't. Triage, they called it. If you had burns over a certain percentage of your body, they didn't even bother. They gave you a cloth and said, "Lie here." I saw one nurse draw an X on a man's forehead. Red paint. That meant do not resuscitate. He watched her do it, didn't flinch, just nodded. The rest of us, those in the gray zone, we were moved into makeshift shelters. Schools, shrines, open fields. I ended up in a tent that had once been used for rice storage. The floor was sticky with old grain paste, but I didn't care. I had a roof. And I had people, living ones. That night, someone passed around a bottle of water. 1 sip each. We passed it like a sacred relic. No one took more than their share. Funny how disaster turns strangers into monks. The humming girl from the school was there too, still humming. Her voice was hoarse now, barely more than a vibration. But she kept at it, over and over. Same melody. Maybe it helped her. Maybe it helped us. By now, the smell of death was constant, inescapable. You breathed it in, slept with it, ate it with every bite of rationed rice. Flies gathered like guests. But we stopped noticing. The human brain, when overwhelmed, flips a switch. I think mine had been stuck in numb for hours. I watched the black rain drip from the tent roof that night and thought, this is what the end of the world looks like. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the uncertainty. We didn't know if help was coming. We didn't know if more bombs were coming. We didn't even know if this was just the beginning. The next morning, I wandered toward what used to be a schoolyard, not because I had a plan. I just remembered hearing something in the night, whispers, footsteps, the faint sound of someone dragging something heavy. It felt like my body needed to keep moving, or it would stop for good. So, I limped through alleys that didn't exist anymore, over sidewalks that now crunched underfoot, like frost, only it wasn't frost. It was bone. Ash. Dust made from things that used to breathe. When I reached the schoolyard, I froze. There were children. Not many. Maybe 10, maybe 12. Sitting on what was once a sandbox, their faces drawn, arms wrapped around each other like cold stones. They were alive, technically, but their eyes had stopped doing what eyes were supposed to do. A few adults were there too. A man with burns running down one side of his face like spilled ink. A woman in a nurse's uniform, so stained with soot you could barely see the red cross. She held a girl in her lap, barely 6 years old, shivering, murmuring something too soft to hear. Over and over, the same 2 syllables. Mizu, Mizu. Water. She was asking for water. I knelt beside them, rummaged through my pockets, even though I already knew they were empty. It was just a gesture. The woman didn't speak. She just nodded, understanding that I had nothing to give. Nearby, a boy was digging at the dirt with a bent spoon. I asked him what he was doing. Looking for my brother, he said. I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat beside him and helped. We dug for an hour, found nothing, but he smiled anyway. Historians still debate the extent to which children understood what had happened. Some say the younger ones didn't grasp death or radiation or politics. Others believe they understood too much, just not with words. You could see it in their drawings later. Houses burning people with no faces, skies raining darkness. And here's your strange fact of the day. Some eyewitnesses claimed They saw flashes of blue light dancing in the sky after the bomb like little electric spirits. Scientists later explained it as Cherenkov radiation, caused when charged particles move faster than light through a medium like air or water. But for survivors, it was just one more thing that didn't belong to Earth. In the corner of the yard, a teacher had set up a blackboard on a piece of plywood. She was writing names on it. Survivors, the missing, the dead. Only a few names had check marks next to them. I watched her write slowly, her hand trembling. Then she turned to the children. "If you remember your name," she said, "come write it." One by one, they came forward. Some had to be helped. Some didn't remember their names. One little girl drew a flower instead. The teacher didn't stop her. I wrote mine in the corner. It looked strange, unfamiliar, like a stranger had borrowed my hand. A few hours later, a man came limping into the yard carrying a tray. Cups of water. Real water. He didn't say where it came from, and no one asked. He handed them out one by one. The girl on the nurse's lap finally got her sip. She smiled. A toothless, cracked lip smile. Then she slumped just a little, and the nurse held her tighter. Was she asleep? Was she gone? We didn't ask. Sometimes you just don't. By midday, the air had thickened again. Not with smoke this time, but with grief. Raw and dull, like a pressure system sitting on your chest. I remember sitting under what used to be a cherry blossom tree, its trunk blackened, but somehow still upright. A boy sat beside me. He looked at the tree and said, "Do you think it'll bloom again?" I told him yes. I lied, but he smiled. That made it worth it. As the sun sank low, people started leaving the yard, drifting off like mist. Maybe toward shelters, maybe just away. I stayed. I didn't want to leave the children, and something about the tree made it feel like a place where things could start again. Even if nothing had started yet. A woman showed up carrying a bag of rice balls, burnt, crushed, but still food. She gave them out without saying a word. When she handed one to me, I almost cried. Not because I was hungry, but because someone remembered how to be kind. That night, someone set up a fire in the center of the yard, a small one surrounded by bricks. We sat around it like survivors in a war movie. Only this wasn't a movie. This was a long, ugly pause in history. I looked at their faces in the firelight. Kids who had seen more horror in one day than most people see in a lifetime. Adults who had nothing left but a heartbeat. And yet they still warmed their hands, still breathed, still listened to the wind like it might bring music again. The teacher sang a song. I didn't recognize the words, but I recognized the tone. It was the kind of melody you hum when there's nothing else to do. A lullaby for the end of the world. One boy whispered, "My mother used to sing that." The teacher looked at him, eyes shining in the darkness. "She still does," she said. I don't know what happened to those kids. Whether they lived, whether they healed. But that night, in the middle of a dead city, they made a schoolyard into something close to sacred. And when I finally lay down in the dirt, under the shadow of a burnt tree, I dreamed, not of fire, not of smoke, but of laughter, just for a moment. I woke up the next morning with a mouth full of ash and a back full of regret. My body felt like a stack of bricks had been dropped on me overnight. The tree above me hadn't moved, but something in the air had shifted, like the silence was starting to break apart into whispers. I heard voices, Low, urgent, uncertain. Not cries, conversations. The first real ones in days. People were returning. Not many, and not with fanfare. But they came with supplies, with questions, and most of all with eyes wide open in horror. I joined them, limping toward a temple that was rumored to be intact. Rumors were all we had. Maps no longer applied, and street names meant nothing when there were no streets. The sun was already high, burning through the smoky veil above, like it had something to prove. The temple stood crooked but present. Its main hall had survived, though one wall was missing, and most of the statues had cracked or crumbled. There, volunteers were setting up makeshift beds, thin mats on wooden boards, clean cloths soaked in boiled rainwater, bowls of barley porridge. It wasn't much, but it was something. A woman with a shaved head, maybe a nun, maybe just someone who'd lost her hair, took one look at me and said, "You're not bleeding. Help carry the others." That's how I ended up working in what passed for a triage center. I wasn't trained. None of us were. We lifted bodies, folded rags into bandages, poured cloudy water into parched mouths. You had to look past the wounds, past the burns that split open like overripe fruit. You had to look into the eyes and pretend everything was going to be fine. I remember one man who clutched a suitcase so tightly they had to pry it from his hands after he passed. Inside, not money, not clothes. A pair of worn sandals and a single photo of a woman and two children smiling in front of a shrine. That was his whole world reduced to grayscale memory and rubber soles. Historians still debate how prepared the Japanese government and military were for this kind of aftermath. Some argue they reacted as quickly as possible. Others claim it was disorganized, reactive, and too little too late. Me? I think nobody, not even the gods, was ready for this. There were whispers of medical teams arriving from the outside. Trains that had stopped miles short of the blast. Planes circling but not landing. Bureaucracy moved slower than death. But a few brave souls got through. One doctor set up shop in what used to be a department store basement. He performed surgeries with a rusted scalpel and a flashlight powered by hand crank. He had no anesthesia. People bit leather straps to keep from screaming. I helped carry one patient down there, a woman whose legs were blackened below the knee. She didn't cry, just said, "Don't let them take both." I didn't have the heart to tell her they already had. There were moments, tiny ones, when humor tried to poke its head above the rubble. A man asked if his eyebrows would grow back thicker. A nurse rolled her eyes and said, "Only if you've been very good this year." Someone else painted a face on a melon and introduced it as Dr. Goro, our new head surgeon. We laughed because we had to. Here's your weird fact for the day. In the weeks after the bombing, survivors started developing purple splotches on their skin, hair falling out in clumps, bleeding from gums and noses. They called it the mystery sickness. Today, we know it as acute radiation syndrome. Back then, it was just another horror with no name. The children were hit hardest, not just by the blast, but by the slow decay that followed. I remember one girl, no more than 7, who insisted on walking herself to the toilet each day. Her legs were swollen, her skin pale, but she held herself with pride. When someone offered to carry her, she said, "No, I'm not a baby. She collapsed that evening and never woke up. I wrote her name on the temple wall with a piece of chalk. It stayed there for weeks until the rain washed it away. We didn't talk about politics in that temple. No debates, no blame, just breath after breath, trying to find a rhythm again. Some prayed, some cursed. Most just sat and stared into space like they were afraid to blink in case something else exploded. Radio broadcasts began to reach us, crackling through the static like ghosts. At first it was vague. Words like unknown destruction, evacuation procedures, national emergency. Then came the rumors of a second bomb, another city, another flash, another hell. We didn't know which city. We didn't know when. All we knew was that we weren't alone in our suffering. The fear came back, harder this time. Not because we feared death, we'd already met it, but because we feared the waiting, the pause before pain, the breath before collapse. Some people packed what little they had and tried to leave the city, headed for hills, tunnels, anywhere. But where do you run when the sky itself is your enemy? One evening, someone lit incense at the front of the temple. A line of survivors gathered, each holding something to burn. A hair ribbon, a paper crane, a piece of cloth. I had nothing, so I tore a strip from my shirt and tied it to the post. We bowed our heads, not in prayer really, just acknowledgement of loss, of time, of the terrible, fragile beauty of what used to be. The sky darkened, not with rain, just with night, and still, no one knew what would happen next. The radio crackled louder the next morning. Someone in the temple had found a battery-operated set miraculously still functioning. They fiddled with the dial until a clear voice, flat official foreign, cut through the static. The words came in Japanese, but the message felt alien. Another bomb, Nagasaki. Not a rumor this time. It had happened. Again. We didn't speak for a long time. Someone dropped a cup. It shattered louder than the blast itself. I remember thinking, it's not over. They could do this every day, every city, until there's nothing left but smoke and bones and black rain. And I remember wondering what they looked like, these men who pressed the buttons, what they ate that morning, whether they thought about the people in the blast zone as real or just necessary. It was the first time anger cut through the numbness. But there was no one to blame in that moment. Just the sky. People panicked. Some ran toward the outskirts, convinced Hiroshima would be hit again. Others clung to the temple like it was the last solid thing on earth. Me, I stayed. Partly out of exhaustion. Partly because I didn't know where to go. Later, we learned that no more bombs were coming. Not for now. But we didn't know that then. We only knew fear. Thick and constant. It pulsed under the skin like a second heartbeat. Historians still debate whether Japan's surrender came because of the bombs or because of the Soviet declaration of war. Some say Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced the emperor's hand. Others argue the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was the real turning point. Honestly, from the ruins of the temple floor, it didn't matter. All we knew was that someone somewhere had finally said, enough. Here's your odd fact of the day. Some survivors of Hiroshima actually made it to Nagasaki, only to be bombed again. Imagine that. Living through one atomic blast, thinking you'd escaped, then getting caught in the second one. That's not fate. That's something else entirely. The word unlucky doesn't begin to cover it. In the days after Nagasaki, the tone of the air changed. There was less movement, less shouting, just a hollow kind of quiet, like the city had exhaled and didn't plan to breathe again. Back in the temple, a group of students arrived, barely more than teenagers, but dressed like nurses and carrying bundles of gauze. They'd been sent from a school miles away, trained in first aid for wartime emergencies. They called themselves the White Wings, and somehow they smiled when they worked. One of them helped clean my feet. Her name was Aiko. She didn't ask what happened. She just unwrapped. The bandages winced and said, "You've been walking on fire." I told her I'd had worse pedicures. She actually laughed. That was rare enough to feel sacred. She asked where my family was. I didn't know. Still didn't. I had stopped hoping for answers. Hope hurt too much. I asked her the same question. She said gone, but they'd want me to help others. So here I am. And she was, every day, cleaning wounds, spooning out porridge, singing lullabies in a voice that shook on the high notes. She was real in a world that had turned to ash. We clung to that. The temple began to change. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It became a message, proof that something, anything had survived. People started carving names into the walls, not graffiti, memorials, loved ones, lost ones, even pets. A man etched a perfect little cat into a corner beam, said it looked like his Torah who had vanished the morning of the bombing. That afternoon, I helped to dig a latrine behind the temple. Not a glamorous job, but necessary. The ground was tough dry on top, wet and sticky below. As I shoveled, I uncovered something smooth. A plate. Porcelain unbroken. Flowers painted in blue glaze. It made no sense. Nothing else had survived intact. I took it to Aiko. She ran her finger over the design and said, "Maybe the earth wanted to give something back." We hung it in the temple entrance. Days blurred. Meals came from passing supply wagons. Medical teams started arriving with real tools, real medicine. They set up tents outside the city, afraid to go too far in. Radiation, they said. We didn't argue. We'd already inhaled half the dust in Hiroshima. If it was going to kill us, it had already started. Strangely, some of us began to feel stronger. Not healthy, just more like people. We cleaned. We repaired what we could. Someone found an old harmonica, played it every evening until it cracked. Sounded like a dying whale, but we applauded anyway. We told stories, not about the bomb, not always, about before. Fishing trips, summer festivals, awkward first crushes. A guy named Daisuke told the same joke every day about a samurai who walks into a bar and forgets his sword. It wasn't funny, but we laughed, because laughter kept the sky from falling in. One day, a woman arrived with a camera. She asked if she could take our photo. We said yes. We stood under the cracked gate, some sitting, some standing, all of us with ash still on our skin and hope trying to grow in our bones. She clicked the shutter. The sound startled a few birds from the trees. We watched them fly, and for the first time in weeks, the sky didn't seem quite so heavy. After a while, we stopped flinching when planes flew overhead. That was the weirdest part, how normal came creeping back like a stray dog. Hesitant, half-starved, uninvited. The first time I heard a radio play music again, I froze. I thought it was another warning. But no, it was just some jazz tune, scratchy, tinny, like the air itself was trying to hum its way back to life. The city, or what was left of it, didn't rebuild in days. It barely stood. But people started staking tiny claims again. Here, someone placed a tatami mat on bare earth and called it home. There, a man used rubble bricks to outline where his shop used to be. I watched him draw a chalk sign on a broken slab of concrete. Fresh fish soon. I don't think he had any fish. I think he just needed the sign. I wandered more in those days, not to find anything, but to see it, to mark where life was coming back. Once I stumbled across an underground medical shelter, a collapsed warehouse basement that had been repurposed. The stairs were half gone. I slid down what was left, half expecting to find nothing but bones. But what I found was astonishing. Candles, makeshift beds, a row of carefully labeled jars containing medicinal herbs, and people wounded, yes, but alert. There was even a chalkboard listing surgery times. A woman named Michiko was in charge. She wore goggles that made her look like an insect and barked orders like a general. "You new guy," she snapped. "Can you sew?" I said no. "Great, you'll learn." And that's how I ended up stitching gauze onto a man's scalp while he told me about his pet turtle, who used to escape the yard by climbing a broom. Not walk. Climb. I told him I didn't believe him. He laughed. Said that turtle survived the bomb. I'll never doubt her again. Historians still debate whether underground shelters like these were official, impromptu, or something in between. Some say they were built for air raids and converted. Others believe they were the last desperate acts of citizens who couldn't bear the thought of giving up. I think it was both. Hope is a funny architect. Here's today's strange fact. Some people reported glowing wounds after the blast. Literally glowing. Scientists later linked it to bioluminescent bacteria. Photohabdus luminescens infecting open cuts in the right conditions. Nature's way of saying, yes, even your injuries can sparkle now. One night in that basement, I sat beside a boy whose leg had been amputated. He was drawing with charcoal on the wall sketches of a city that didn't exist anymore. Temples, boats, cherry blossoms. I asked him why he wasn't drawing the ruins. He said, "Because I want to remember the real Hiroshima." That hit me, the real Hiroshima. Not the crater, not the shadows. The city of rivers and bridges and old men shouting about radishes. The city of cats and bicycles and summer lanterns. I had almost forgotten it existed. But he hadn't. That boy with one leg and soot in his hair remembered better than all of us. I started drawing too. Badly. Mostly stick figures. But the act mattered. I drew the lanterns floating on the river. I drew the old temple cat. I drew my parents' faces, half faded, but still holding each other's hands. The people in the basement laughed at my art. Called me sensei. I told them if I was a sensei, then we were all doomed. But in that laughter, something cracked. Something warm. That night, I dreamt again. This time, I wasn't in ruins. I was on a boat drifting down one of Hiroshima's rivers. The lanterns were back. The air was soft. Someone sang a lullaby I hadn't heard since childhood. And in that dream, no one was missing. I woke up crying, not sobbing, just quiet tears sliding through the ash still stuck to my cheeks. There was a whisper, that morning news that the emperor would speak. That had never happened before, ever. The man was a ghost, a symbol, a god you weren't supposed to look at. And now he would speak to us into our homes. We gathered around a radio. the volume cranked, the room so silent you could hear breath hitching. And then he spoke. It wasn't dramatic, no grand speech, no fireworks, just a soft, monotone voice saying things like, "Unbearable damage, new and cruel, bombs endure the unendurable." People cried. Others just stared. Some bowed their heads. We'd lost. The war was over. It didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like a pause, like someone had finally hit the stop button on a song that had played too long. The man with the turtle stood up and said, "Does this mean I can rebuild my house?" Someone answered, "Only if your turtle helps." We all laughed again, not because it was funny, because it was human. Aiko found me in the evening. She pressed a rice ball into my hand wrapped in cloth slightly warm. "You should leave," she said. "Why?" "They'll want witnesses. People who saw. People who remember." I stared at the rice ball. I hadn't held something so normal in weeks. "But where would I go?" She shrugged. "Wherever the sky doesn't glow." That night, I sat on the temple steps. The stars were out. Actual stars, not falling embers or flares or radioactive particles. Real constellations. I traced one with my finger. Orion, maybe. Or something close enough. I thought about the people I'd met. The humming girl. The boy with the marble. Michiko and her glowing wounds. Aiko and her songs. The boy who still remembered what Hiroshima looked like when it was whole. So, I realized something. They didn't just survive. They resisted, not with guns, not with speeches, but with memories. They kept the real Hiroshima alive, even when everything else tried to erase it. And that more than anything felt like hope. I returned years later, not to stay, just to see. I needed to know what had become of the place where time had stopped for me and for so many others. I wanted to see if the ashes had turned into flowers or if the whispers still lingered in the air like they did in my bones. The train into Hiroshima was quiet, the kind of quiet that clung to your clothes. I looked out the window and saw buildings, actual buildings, glass and steel, concrete and color. People on bicycles, students in uniforms, old women, sweeping their storefronts. From a distance, it looked like any other city in Japan, but it wasn't. It could never be. I stepped onto the platform and my breath caught, not because of the heat, but because I was walking on streets that used to be unwalkable. I was breathing air that once smelled only of smoke and sorrow. I had stepped back into a memory, but the memory had grown legs and moved on without me. I wandered, letting the streets guide me. Some were new. Some had familiar curves, ghost curves, like the city still remembered its old skeleton. I found the bridge, the river, the temple. Or rather the new version of it, rebuilt stronger, cleaner, but not colder. People left flowers at the steps. Someone had painted the steps with poetry. And there beside the door was the same blue porcelain plate Aiko and I had found, mounted in glass. A tiny plaque beneath it read, "Found after the bombing," proof that something endured. I touched the glass. It was cool and real. I moved on. The atomic bomb dome stood like a broken crown by the river, preserved exactly as it had been, charred, skeletal, unmistakable. A monument, not just to death, but to truth. I stood in front of it for a long time, watching tourists shuffle past, phones raised, heads tilted. Some were crying, some were silent. One kid said, "It looks like something from a movie." His father corrected him gently. No, this was real. I appreciated that. There was a museum nearby. Inside were artifacts, stories, photos. The Marble Boy's story was there, his name even. The nurse with the lullaby. The teacher who wrote names on the blackboard. Their stories hadn't been forgotten. They were remembered in glass cases on walls and recordings. I didn't put my name down. I didn't tell anyone I had been there, that I had walked barefoot through that melted street, that I had sat under that blackened tree and dreamed of laughter. It wasn't necessary. The ashes already remembered me. Before I left, I went back to the river. The same river where I had seen bodies float, where black rain had fallen, where silence had once screamed. And now it held lanterns, dozens of them, glowing softly as they floated downstream. A peace ceremony. People writing messages on paper, lighting candles, setting them adrift. I read one that said, "For those we never met, but never forgot." That one made me sit down. I lit a lantern too. I didn't write anything on it, just watched the flame dance inside like a heartbeat. Then I let it go. The current carried it past the bridge under the weeping willows around the bend, and I smiled, not because it was over, but because it wasn't. Because even after humanity touched hell, we didn't vanish. We remembered, we rebuilt. We chose to float our grief on lanterns instead of letting it anchor us forever. So if you ever visit Hiroshima, and you stand at that river's edge, and you see the lanterns glowing like tiny ghosts of light, don't just take a photo. Close your eyes. Listen. You might hear laughter under the surface, a lullaby in the wind, a name whispered by the water. Because Hiroshima didn't disappear. It became a promise that we would never let the sky fall that way again.